Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's SANS webcast, Threat Spotlight, Cloud Native Ransomware, sponsored by Vectra. My name is Carol Auth of SANS. Today's featured speakers are Matt Bromley, SANS analyst, and Gokul Rajagopalan of Vectra. If during the webcast you have any questions for our presenters, please enter them into the Q&A window at any time. Please note that this webcast is being recorded, and a copy of the slides and recording of this webcast will be available for viewing later today and can be found on the SANS registration page. And with that, I'd like to hand the webcast over to our presenters.
Boom, excellent. Carol, thank you so much for that introduction. Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where in the world you're joining us from today. I'm excited to be bringing this content to you today. We've got a pretty interesting webinar lined up. This is actually a webinar that we're doing in concurrence with a paper that just got thrown into the Zoom chat as well, that we did a threat spotlight with the folks over at Vectra talking about cloud native ransomware. Now, this actually started out as a really interesting discussion between myself and the folks over at Vectra a little while ago. This paper's been in the works for a little bit, just as we've kind of seen the landscape change and seen things shift and whatnot. But it started out as a really good discussion about, this kind of upcoming threat space, if you will, these upcoming concerns about, hey, we've got lots of organizations who are kind of building these new assets and building this new attack surface on a daily basis. What are they doing to, kind of protect and defend against this? And then simultaneously, what are our adversaries doing as they see all this happen? So it started out as a pretty good discussion here, and it turned into this really good analysis of, I think, what it means to be cloud native ransomware. Sorry, I should say what ransomware against cloud native assets means. It's a good start. It also talks about things that organizations should consider implementing. So we've got, as I mentioned, a really solid white paper. Highly recommend checking that out. If you've got any sort of footprint in the cloud whatsoever, I highly recommend reading this, going through it, looking through our recommendations, and also kind of maybe shifting some of the analysis focus on how you've been treating your cloud footprint from a security posture perspective as well. Full disclosure, we've got some additional things in the works with Vectra as well. So folks, this is not the first time you'll see myself and Vectra on a webcast talking about cloud footprints, cloud-focused developments, cloud-focused threats, and or ransomware as well. So we've got some really cool stuff in the works. Here's our first webcast, Cloud Native Ransomware. Now, a quick note, this is what's known as a threat spotlight, which means our focus of this here is on the threat itself, what that looks like to organizations, and then some not minor, I should say, but I'm going to call them a pretty basic starting list of mitigations, implementations, technology, things that should be done to help mitigate some of these threats and potentially kind of, dissuade attackers from finding success in your environment. That said, I got to issue this like really simple but important caveat here. This is an ever-changing space. As we grow from a cloud perspective, as adversaries grow from a tactic and a TTP perspective, there's a very good chance that we're going to start to see new things come out from adversaries. What we want to do is get your organization in a place and get your security posture in a place that you're ready to defend that future wave of whatever comes down the line. So you're going to see some of our discussion points focus around those. Now, the way today is going to work, first half of this webcast is going to be me talking just like this, going through some of the slides and some of the content, some of the core content from the paper. And then the latter half is going to be myself and Gokul going through kind of more of a discussion panel, if you will, a back and forth. We've got some points from the paper to bring up and talk about. Gokul's also got some content to share with us. But then last but not least, we also want to hear what you have to say as well. So that Q&A window is always open. In fact, if you see my eyes navigate down towards this side, that's me looking at the Q&A window to see if anyone's asked anything. We'll do our best to feature those conversations as we go along. But with that said, let's go ahead and jump right into it. So as I mentioned, today we're going to have a brief discussion, relatively quick, about cloud native ransomware, and then we're going to get into our discussion panel between the two of us. Oh, first question came in. Great. Someone came back and said, how do I access the white paper? Check out the Zoom chat, everyone. A link to the white paper was thrown in there. You should be able to just grab that out of the chat just in case it, that message has passed you by or anything like that. I'm going to grab I'm going to Let me see. Okay, it's not letting me paste in, but Carol, if we could throw that link to everyone once again, just in case the chat history didn't load or they're looking for an access to the paper now, they're more than welcome to have that. So that should be in the chat for you folks there. Okay. Anyways, moving on. Let's get into kind of our first maybe side of the content here, which is focusing on cloud native ransomware itself. So we started this paper out with what I'm going to call really this kind of conundrum of business growth and development that we've got to deal with from an adversarial perspective. And that, tends to start our discussion on the cloud. And I look at really, maybe a lot of folks tend to focus on kind of the last 24 months as that pandemic focused discussion. I'll take the past maybe 5 to 10 years and say that, we've seen more and more adoption growth into the cloud, whether it be a single service or a simple application, all the way to just full cloud adoption and, organizations moving a significant double-digit percentage of their operations into the cloud as well. I've, done work with enough companies over the years that some companies who I talked to 10 years ago, 10, 15 years ago, talked about, yeah, this is something we'll never do. Our business is just too niche. We're not able to have our operations in the cloud. We're not able to decentralize things. Guess what? They're now one of my biggest proponents. And they're the ones who are calling me up and saying, hey, Matt, you need to see this brand new feature, this brand new product that came out, this brand new capability changes the way we've done things. A lot more startups these days, a lot more of your newer organizations, if you will, tend to exist very heavily in the cloud, if not primarily. And what this means is as newer businesses either grow organically or get bought up and integrated into a larger or an older organization, we start to see these very, very diverse footprints take place. We start to see, some on-prem, some in the cloud. We start to see the security program of two companies being forced to marry and to work together. And we continue to see businesses also just say, you know what? Look, I'm aware that there's threats in the cloud. I'm aware that things could happen to us, but we've got to be able to provide what our customers need. We've got to be able to meet the organizational needs. So that, I think, kind of throws in our first discussion point, or the first thing we focus on in the paper here, which is, look, we get it, right? The cloud footprint is something that organizations are having trouble managing. We get it. Adversaries are moving towards the cloud as one of their primary target and vectors. We get it. This is a space that is not as well developed from an on-prem perspective internally, and I'll quantify that in a second. But you know what? Despite all of those risks and all of those concerns, the growth and adoption to the cloud is just monumental. We've got some statistics on it in just a moment that I'll talk about. And what this signals to me is that, first off, even though there's these looming threats out there, organizations have to be able to provide what their customers need and what their operations need. So we've got to keep that in mind as security folks. We can't just say, look, the cloud is bad, so don't ever use a thing, Now, let me be clear. I feel very safe saying, please don't ever use single factor authentication. I feel very comfortable with that position. Like, the statistics are just way too much in our favor that you need to have multiple factors in order to just really prohibit a lot of adversary success. But I do not feel comfortable telling a company, hey, don't ever use this particular service or this particular feature or functionality, because it may be what the business needs. It may be exactly what it needs. And it's funny, every time I see one of the major cloud providers introduce a brand new feature or brand new capability, I can remember very distinctly when serverless things came out. We think of kind of functions or lambdas or things like that. When those features or capabilities came out, I remember talking to security folks who just had all of these sort of, this is a horrible idea. Here's all the reasons why it's bad. Here's all the things you should never do, blah, blah, blah. And it was just this constant barrage of why it's terrible that's out there. And then we had businesses who came to us and were like, look, I can cut my cost by 80% by moving to this thing. I'm sorry, but the revenue battle wins. And I've said this on multiple webcasts before. Security folks, if you ever want to lose a battle, pick a battle with revenue. And that's what we've seen. So without belaboring this point too much, the focus that we started out with here is, look, we could spend all day saying, do not move to the cloud because that's where adversaries are going to get you. It's going to fall on deaf ears. Far too many companies are needing to move to the cloud, and they're moving there. But rather than say, here's why don't do something, instead, we shifted our magnifying glass to say, well, instead of saying this is bad, don't do it, why don't we recognize just how adversaries have kept up with this change as well? And this is really the introduction to the paper here, if you will. We introduced with a 2022 report from the CyberRisk Alliance Business Intelligence found that their most common ransomware attack vectors at 35 and 32% respectively were cloud infrastructure and SaaS applications. Folks, this confirms this kind of initial fear that we had, which was, yes, this is a growing vector for adversaries. Yes, this is a growing problem for organizations. Yes, there's an issue with managing and securing these cloud footprints just because, well, why else would it be a growing statistic? Now, there's two possibilities there. One of them is we've seen a faster adoption rate, which means the percentages just go up because there's more targets out there. I think it's a combination of that, plus we're just not securing these things properly. Adversaries, unfortunately, are catching up with cloud infrastructure, catching up with cloud technologies just as fast as we are. But that growth kind of makes sense, in my opinion, because if I prop up an internal organization and I wrap all sorts of on-prem security around it, and I drop in those firewalls and I protect this network and I minimize my egress ingress points and I do everything I can to minimize that attack footprint, my adversary has a pretty, I won't say it's tough, but I'll say it's a little more of an uphill battle in order to get into my environment. And then they've got to figure out what I'm servicing, what I've got in there, what capabilities I have. Sometimes it's as easy as enumerating open ports. Other times it's crafting a really, really well executed spear phishing campaign to just gain one entry in to see what I can find. But my point about that is I have a much easier capability of minimizing external adversary knowledge, as opposed to perhaps what a cloud footprint may look like. I may have an organization who's got this massive sprawl of a cloud footprint, and adversaries can figure that out just by simply scanning for IP addresses, looking at types of services, clearly identifying, oh, this is an S3 bucket. Oh, this is a storage blob. That's a web application. It's hosted inside of a certain IP space. So I have an idea as to what this is. The reconnaissance changes completely because there's a much more defined footprint of what's out there. And I equate this, to some other kind of feature sets as well. We could go to a PaaS or a platform as a service site like Heroku, for example, and we could easily go prop up a business running off of a platform as a service. Now I can put a custom domain in front of that. So to my customers, it looks just like any other website, but my adversaries have the ability to dig a step deeper and say, oh, I know where this thing is hosted. I know what it is. My point being this: if the cloud footprint is so appreciably different from an on-prem footprint, then why do we have so many organizations trying to fit a cloud footprint into an on-prem approach? And that's the other thing that we took, the other approach, no pun intended, that we took inside of this paper here, was to analyze and examine some of the differences between these two, because I see far too many organizations have this wonderful on-prem security posture, which basically is, if I took out all of your cloud stuff, for lack of a better term, you have an amazing security program. But the moment I add cloud in, which is what a lot of folks do, they simply just tack it on at the end. The moment I add your cloud footprint in there, you went from a well-secured organization to, oh, now we have databases facing the internet with admin access. Now we have S3 buckets facing the internet with read-write privileges available to anybody. You took what was a really solid program, and unfortunately, the addition of that cloud made it less secure. Now, let me be very clear. I'm not saying that cloud is inherently insecure. I'm saying we need to consider the differences between the two. That gap right there of this is not the same, so I have to approach it differently, that's where adversaries find success, in that gap right there. Because ransomware in the cloud is very different from ransomware on-prem as well. So let's talk about some high-level TTPs here and some of the differences between the two. And I'm going to use these and walk through these to also identify where cloud native ransomware is very different. So we'll start out with initial access. Remember that portrait of that perimeter that I painted earlier. This is where an adversary may need to craft a phishing campaign, set up a watering hole, compromise an external site, look for a vulnerable web application, hopefully get malware inside of the organization. They need to do something to get that initial access into the organization. That's their first step. And we're all familiar with that kind of initial access followed by that reconnaissance and that sprawl internally. Well, initial access into the cloud, that might just be as simple as, oh, look, the authentication parameters are not set up correctly on this account. I can manipulate tokens, or I can just go steal account credentials and boom, now I'm in. It's much easier because you've got this wonderfully amazing cloud access panel that has everything all in one place. So if I can get access to the right credentials, I don't need to sift my way through a company or an organizational footprint anymore. I can just simply load up the control panel or the console, if you will, and go from there. The token manipulation that I dropped in here also speaks towards the beauty of APIs. If I am a company with an on-prem presence, if you will, I hopefully do not have a ridiculous amount of APIs that are internet facing. That limits that type of attack surface. Cloud, exact opposite. We want everything to be driven by APIs as close as we possibly can. We actually did a webcast on API security a week or two ago here at SANS, and we discussed during that webcast that somewhere in the vicinity of 80% of web traffic out there is API driven. Guess what? If my APIs are not set up correctly, my accounts are given too many permissions, my adversaries have another way in. So that initial access just changes completely. Next thing we get into is privilege escalation. This is that common kind of, we get in as a least privileged user, and then an adversary's got to find an exploit or a weakness or a password file or Excel sheet or whatever it is that they can use to then escalate privileges. Because once again, remember, they've got to get into an initial access or get into an initial foothold and then work their way up and out from there. That's how a ransomware threat actor goes from one compromised system to many compromised systems. They've got to find that account that they can move laterally with. They can do that by, again, stealing, manipulating credential mechanisms, stealing credentials. A potential OS exploitation may allow them to escalate or elevate and run as a higher privileged user. But if I take that to the cloud, if I've got someone who's logged in as one of those admin users, they're already there. They got that twofer with that simple account access. It may not be needed. They may not need to escalate credentials or escalate privileges, if you will. Now, let's back up and say that from a cloud perspective, a user did get access to a least privileged account. Well, there's a potential there of looking for vulnerable web applications, looking for a vulnerable cloud service or a vulnerable cloud provider. They could also go the route of, you know what? How is this web application configured? I view this as more of a traditional sense, which is exploiting something that's running with far too many permissions in order to escalate privileges. So perhaps I shouldn't say it's unneeded, but I'll say more at this stage, if they're already in, it's some of the same TTPs that are out there. But let's circle back to my initial discussion point, which was, if I have someone who's already in with those admin level credentials, and dare I say those root level credentials, which I hope never ever happens, unfortunately, they've already escalated privileges just by simply being there. Now, asset discovery, this is where a ransomware adversary tends to either do really well or tends to not do really well from an on-prem situation. So if we walk through this ransomware attack so far, someone's got initial access into an environment, they've escalated privileges, which means they have the ability to move throughout an environment at their will. How are they going to discover what assets are there? Because remember, an on-prem attack is going to go look for things like hypervisors, backup servers, file servers, third-party connections, any data they can lock up to get ransom, to get access. So they're going to use things like automated scripts. We've seen adversaries roll in with scripts in all languages. We've seen adversaries deploy discovery, scanning software, things like Nmap that can be used to scan and look for open ports, look for systems. We see Active Directory discovery take place. All sorts of things can be done because these objects are linked inside of that on-prem environment. Now, this may be where cloud has a benefit, because you may come back and you may be like, well, Matt, this is great because not all of my assets in the cloud are linked to each other. So even if someone did compromise that web application over here, they wouldn't get access to all of my storage buckets over there. That's great. I like that logical separation between those two, and there might be an inherent benefit in there. But let's go back to my initial example, which is someone gets access to stolen credentials. Someone gets insight into that cloud. They're at that central control panel. We can also, and an adversary will easily do this, we can also just run things like a perimeter or an attack surface scan, which adversaries will do. Remember, I mentioned earlier, it's pretty trivial to see if something's an S3 bucket versus something being a web application versus something being hosted in a cloud provider versus hosted in an on-prem location. Well, that reconnaissance can actually be a very fruitful asset discovery. And one of the biggest spaces right now that we see a lot of organizations employing is attack surface management. And this is that discovery of, I think I have a big cloud footprint, but just how big is it? Adversaries perform the exact same type of scans that we do. If you don't believe me, go run a report on some of your organizational IP addresses over at Shodan. That is your viewpoint into what do I look like from an adversary's eyes. That asset discovery is another significant move for another reason. If your cloud infrastructure is segmented the way that it should be and is set up the way that it should be, you should have, and again, depending on your business needs, I'm going to say the minimal amount of internet-facing cloud products as needed. The minimal amount. This is rarely the case, and I hate to say it. Most of the time, these assets are public-facing. Maybe it's read-only privileges. Maybe it's a single-factor authentication. Maybe it's linked, very, very loosely linked to another service. But remember my earlier example about the way that businesses grow organically or via M&A? That M&A side of things tends to introduce a lot of risks to an organization because that cool little hot company that just got added into the portfolio, yeah, they were deploying databases that were open and they were deploying storage products that were wide open and read write to everyone. And there's tons of security researchers every day who continue to uncover these open databases and uncover these open assets. And guess what? They are all internet facing. This once again changes the way we have to approach some of these different steps. Y'all remember when I started talking about asset discovery, I had this buildup of initial access, privilege escalation, lateral movement, and finding out what was where. Well, if all of my cloud assets are facing the internet, API accessible via a single point of credentials with maybe single factor, hopefully multi-factor auth in front of them, what you've done is you've actually made it a little bit easier to discover your assets. But more importantly, we have to understand the differences between the two. So at this point, in an on-prem scenario, my adversary has gained access, got privileges, and discovered the things that they want to know about. Well, the next step then is to move laterally and once again, go about and get access to all these, make sure that those credentials that you stole give you access to all of the various assets that you want. You've discovered backup servers. Can you access them? You've discovered file shares. Can you access them? Things like that. That's great. In the cloud, and I spent a lot of time building this up, I may not have that segregation. I may not have that buildup. I may not have the ability to hide all these assets behind multiple layers of firewalls and defense in depth. I may just have a bunch of things that are facing outward with hopefully correctly configured permissions on them. Last but not least, the final step of the ransomware attack. At this point, my adversary on-prem knows my network, has accounts, knows where all the valuable assets are, knows where the key data points are, knows where everything they need to go after is. They've built out and understand my environment as well as they need to. Probably better than some IT departments are out there, unfortunately. The next step is to simply just turn on that automated ransomware deployment and go. Sometimes they steal the data, and we've all seen those extortion cases where an adversary will get access to data and they'll use that as a way to threaten payment and slowly leak things out and let it go piece by piece. We've also seen, obviously, cases where ransomware just locks up the environment and that's it. We're done. We're now at a point of pay us or you'll never get access to your data again. Okay, we've just built out an on-prem ransomware attack. Well, how does that change in the cloud? First off, with all of these external facing services that we talked about in asset discovery and lateral movement, maybe I don't need to lock up the entire organization. We saw this happen back in, I think, 2017, 2018. There was a string of database ransoms taking place. There's a lot of research out there about kind of the early stages of like Elasticsearch and MongoDB and CouchDB and that kind of stuff. But, a few years ago, adversaries were simply dropping into a database, being given admin privileges and just encrypting the data, or even worse, deleting the data and saying, hey, I replicated your database. If you want it back, pay me. Now, for some organizations, this may have been a pretty, it was our dev environment, whatever, we're not really too worried about it. But for others, folks, we're talking about terabytes of production environment data that was out here. But let's think about the key difference there. Let's focus on the attack of a database. If it's an on-prem system that is correctly segmented off, defense in depth in place, my adversary has to work their way through gaining access, gaining the right privileges, finding the database server, kicking off hopefully the right exploits, encrypting the data, and then they've got to move all that data out of there as well. So not only are they having to add all these additional steps to the attack, they're also going to have to move all that data through the same pipe that they're trying to stay hidden inside of, as opposed to, oh, I'm running an open database in a cloud provider and we're not monitoring egress traffic because it's the cloud and our security team just simply is not built for that. So my adversary just got what? They got front door access to a service that may have previously been locked behind multiple layers of a defense in depth strategy, number one. Number two, there was zero protections in place. They were admin on default. I don't want to throw too much shade because this has now been changed, but CouchDB back in the day, when you logged into when you hit the page at a certain port, it said in a very interesting approach there, welcome to the admin party. So that's one change that can be made. The other change that can be made is from a cloud native perspective, from a cloud perspective. Maybe I don't need to roll in with ransomware. Maybe I don't need to do any of that. If I've got the right credentials inside of your environment, maybe I could just change your credentials. Maybe I could just modify your access into your cloud providers. Maybe I can segment off some of your cloud services off to a particular side. Maybe I could just simply change keys, change tokens, revoke API access, hold all of these things hostage. So my point is this. I've spent a good amount of time now, because I'm going to move into my discussion with Gokul in just a few moments here. But there's a really interesting analysis that I think security teams need to perform on, I'm defending against ransomware, correct? Correct. Cool. Are we defending against ransomware on-prem or in the cloud? Well, I don't know, Matt. What are the differences between the two? That's what we just spent some time talking over. My on-prem attack, I feel like everybody knows. In fact, some of you may have been watching this past few minutes and just been saying, Matt, you just literally walked through a ransomware attack. We get it. We've walked through this for years. We know what this looks like. Cool. Are you defending your cloud environment against those same type of threats as well? Are you telling me that your defense of S3 buckets, Lambda functions, and EC2 resources is built around an adversary stealing Active Directory credentials? I would certainly hope not, because the differences there are very, very pivotal in the way that we approach that security. And I think our discussion is going to flesh some more of this out as well. So with that said, I'm at about halfway through our webcast here. Gokul, I see you just came off mute and I see your camera is on. How are you doing today, sir?
Doing very well, thanks, Matt.
Excellent. All right. So I've given us a half an hour lead up towards Matt's brain dump of on-prem versus cloud ransomware. And the big reason I walk through this for everyone is not to reiterate what an on-prem ransomware attack looks like, but to get you thinking about what are you actually defending against and how are you applying this towards your cloud native ransomware approach. So Gokul, you're going to join me now for a discussion. I know we've got some questions lined up and I'm going to encourage the audience to submit their questions as well. We already had one question come in, which I'm just going to nip in the bud right now, which says it feels like these topics are very just general ransomware. What exactly is the focus on cloud native here? I'm just going to say, first off, hopefully, if you're viewing this as this is our general ransomware protection, great. I'm curious to see how big your cloud footprint is and if you're defenses are any different in that sense. And then number two, the discussion I'm going to have with Gokul is going to hopefully flesh some of this out. And then Gokul, you've got some stuff from Vectra side to share with us as well, correct?
Yes.
Perfect. Okay. All right. Well, let's get into our first question. Now, audience, we do have a few questions lined up that are just teed up on the slide so you can follow along, add your insight. As I said in the beginning, feel free to jump in the Q&A and use it as interactively as you'd like. We like the back and forth. But Gokul, first question for us to ponder over here is my cloud provider responsible for keeping my data safe? So all that stuff I just walked through, is that negated by using the right provider?
So partly. So without question, cloud providers bear some responsibility, and that's essentially what they've outlined as part of the shared responsibility model and everything. So for their part, cloud providers ensure physical security of the facilities, the infrastructure. They have a gazillion SOC certifications and whatnot. They offer the tools and framework and recommendations for application and data security. Arguably, since its inception, cloud has been viewed with a lot of suspicion. And so from day one, a lot more has gone into providing the tools and the capabilities to secure data and applications compared to traditional data centers. So I would argue for their part, the cloud providers have gone a long way. But then how these tools are used in the context of a user's application is not something a cloud provider can necessarily dictate. Right? How is a cloud provider going to know where your application needs to be accessible from, and as a result, what IP spaces need to be open, what's minimum set of permissions and policies that need to be applied to a user? They don't know that. And so all they can do there is give you the tools. So if you look at it, attacks in the cloud are seldom attributed to vulnerabilities in cloud security providers. So in terms of recommendations, cloud providers subscribe to the NIST framework. They basically give us a whole lot of tools, but without question, the last mile in that responsibility chain belongs to the end user.
Yeah, and I think this is a common misconception that we see a lot of organizations use as well. I think you summed it up in a very good way, which is they give us the tools to be successful. Everything you need is there. In fact, I often lean on AWS's IAM page, which very clearly says what to do with the root account when you set it up. It's a very straightforward alert boxes everywhere letting you know, create admin accounts, do not be doing things as root. And I really like that approach about it. But you're right. If we go and deploy a particular service via the cloud, the cloud provider does not know that the any firewall rule that we put in place is a mistake. Or if it's just, hey, I don't know how to program a firewall, so I'm just going to open everything. Or if it is, no, the way this application is built, I want all of these ports exposed, or the way that the service is being structured. You're right. They can offer as much guidance as possible. Hey, did you know that any rule can be this or be that? But at the end of the day, I'd be very hard pressed to see them forcing, security best practices on everyone. Now, let's extend an olive branch here, Gokul, because I believe some cloud providers are enforcing multi-factor auth, which is a great step. Some of them are enforcing multi-factor auth for their services. So the one that comes to mind for me is kind of Azure versus O365. If you think of Azure as the cloud portal versus O365 is kind of a product, but also its own sort of a portal as well. You've got, some not inherent, but you've got some security layers that can be enforced at a much higher, but also a service specific functionality as well.
And also measures like updating defaults in response. Like no cloud provider gives you storage buckets that are public by default. It's all locked down, and this is a change that they made a couple of years ago, because if you look at 2014 to 2017, most of the breaches in the cloud could be attributed to just data walking out of a publicly exposed bucket. So they're keeping an eye on it. They're making updates. They're adding capabilities, but there's still, like I said, the last mile and the buck stops with the user.
Yes, very true, very true. Now, the only thing I'd add in there, I think, Google, if you remember a few years ago, we had that, I think that former AWS employee find a way to route through multiple organizations and things like that via token abuse or something. That's obviously, you know, a cloud provider situation if you find yourself in there. But I think those are far and few between from what we've seen. Question came in about what site did you mention that duplicated how adversaries would scan my site? The site that I talked about was shodan.io. I'm now going to send this to the Q&A window for anyone who's curious about what that was. www.shodan.io is a really good kind of, a lot of folks view it as like an IoT scanner. I think it's good for scanning anything that's internet facing. So I'll throw that out there. Google, next question. This is maybe one that you can help offer our audience some insight into what's going on here. What cloud assets are threat actors targeting based on what you folks are seeing over at Vectra?
Yeah, and we've spoken with dozens of customers who are in this phase of migration to cloud and trying to sort through what this new landscape means for them from a security standpoint. It begins with what one would consider information of value, and then backing that into where that information may reside. So depending on the application stack, this information, in most cases is databases. It's in a lot of cases, it is code repositories. If you're talking about a lot of the tech companies, that's where the intellectual property lies. There's image files, software image files, not the cute kitty, but VM images and so on. And then, credentials, that's another big source. In some cases it's PII, in other cases it's just access and credentials. Given this information, generic block storage and object storage services are the most likely targets. Not necessarily because they're easier or harder than any other service, but just that they're most likely. 90% of the enterprises, where are they going to store their data in AWS? It's probably S3 in some way, shape, or form, right? So those are typically the cloud services that, as an attacker, that's the first place you would want to go look. And then, there's all other hosted databases and whatnot that you would continue your journey onto.
Yep. Exactly. I think it's good to identify that and point that out. So folks, that's, what the discussions that Vectra's had and some of the things that they've seen. I'd add in as well, at the very beginning of the webcast, we did talk about some research that's come out, that CRA BI report that found that SaaS applications and web applications and SaaS applications represent kind of, 2/3 worth of the entry vectors, or 67% worth of the entry vectors. The other kind of thing to keep in mind there, if you will, is, we may have web applications that previously existed on-prem. They now exist in the cloud. And does that make them a cloud native threat? Does that mean, adversaries are finding success there? I think it means we need to reconsider kind of the back end of things. We're going to talk in a little bit about detection and response and stuff, but I want you to think about, from a cloud perspective, what have you moved from an on-prem location or from a dedicated server, if you will, to more of a cloud hosted platform or a cloud hosted, a provider service, and how has that kind of changed that landscape there? But I'm in agreement. I think, some of the threats that we're seeing, that block storage seems to be one. I think that database threat is out there as always, that's something that continually exists as well. But to hear about credentials being something taken frequently, that totally makes sense to me. I think that sounds like one of the easiest vectors for adversaries to go through. All right. So one of the first things we talked about in the paper was asset awareness. Now, if any of you have seen me talk about this before, I'm a huge proponent of visibility. not as the only thing that an organization should do, but as a growing metric that should be deployed out there, depending on how the business is growing. I think visibility is something, or asset awareness is something that is necessary. To Gogol's point just a moment ago, block storage, things that are out there that we're using. If I go into an organization, I say, do you have any S3 buckets? The best answer I can get is yes, we have 500. The worst answer I can get is we have no clue. And I'd say striking a balance somewhere between those two is a good start. Gokul, what are your thoughts though on asset awareness versus ransomware?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, you've got to know about your crown jewels before the attacker knows about them. So especially as this problem has become accentuated because of the decentralized DevOps model in the cloud, right? So now suddenly, you have 50 groups in the organization that independently have the ability to deploy resources, spin up applications, and basically make changes multiple times a day. And so suddenly security teams are, they wake up to a dozen new services or dozens of regions, hundreds of accounts, thousands of user principals, because now every machine or resource has its own identity. And so, security is unfortunately often the last part of the organization that comes into this digitization realm, although that is changing, thankfully. And the other thing you alluded to earlier was about, acquisitions, mergers of organizations, acquisitions, etc. And that introduces a whole new dimension of multi-cloud strategies, because the organization you just acquired may have chosen a different cloud provider, and now suddenly, how do you keep up with all of it? So from that standpoint, knowing about what's deployed out there, again, it's necessary, and it gives you a head start, but that, to me, that gives you a fodder for thought on what more you need to deploy to defend. Just knowing about assets is not going to protect you, but it's a starting point to give you some focus on your countermeasures.
Agreed. No, a good vantage point for any organization is to be aware of what they've got out there. Moving on, Gogo, I think you made an interesting case for asset awareness, some of the value of, why we need this, and also, right, knowing about the valuable assets and the valuable data in your environment before an adversary does. But is that enough? I mean, is awareness, is it a starting place, or is it really everything that we need?
It is, without question, the starting point. Mm-hmm. It puts you at a, I cannot tell you the number of organizations when I speak with them and start with simple questions like, hey, do you know how many regions your cloud is deployed in? Just AWS regions. Do you know how many accounts? Do you know what identity sources are federated? Do you know, to your example, how many buckets you have and what you have in those? Like, there are some that are just empty buckets. There are some that are hit, by the application tens of thousands of times a day. Do you know what lies in what bucket? I think all of that is crucial to understanding the magnitude of the operation you have and planning for efficiencies, because when you've got tens of thousands of resources, and you'll find a lot of gaps to plug, and you need a logical way to start prioritizing those.
Yeah, no,
and
100%.
Asset awareness is a very good place to start.
Yes, agreed. I think knowledge of it is the best place, because again, it gives you that kind of, hey, we know about this that's out there. Moving forward, and we talked about this in our paper as well, about how access rights can be something that can contribute. How, I talked earlier about just needing to take over an account. in order to potentially, launch a ransomware attack by just changing parameters of that account and things like that. How do you, in your opinion, how do access rights contribute towards a ransomware defense? Is this kind of that concurrent thing that should be done, or is it, something that can't be fixed?
Well,
and yes, I totally set you up for the answer there.
Yeah, I mean, access rights are the biggest attack vector, no question about that, right? And it's interesting because credentials to the cloud or to access the cloud typically get compromised outside the cloud. It's your phishing of credentials that are, single sign-on to your cloud provider. It's an app with a vulnerability. It's a leak of source code, somewhere on GitHub, someone hard-coded credentials. It could start anywhere outside the cloud. And that part is a lot harder to control and plug all leaks than even, securing what's inside the cloud, right? So to my mind, that is the single biggest attack vector. And credentials are also now, once they're in the cloud, that's how attackers move laterally in the cloud, right? And then roles and policies. An organization we are currently helping has 90,000 user entities, which assumed about 15 million roles, as in role assumption events, which is like temporary assumptions to execute a certain task in a month. So imagine what an attacker can do with access to one or a few of these credentials, and what an uphill battle it is to effectively seal the policies for all of these 90,000 users, right? So that's where the challenge lies. Obviously, if that gets completely airtight, we're in good shape, but what's the likelihood of being able to operationally get that done? So in most cases, what I hypothesize is zero trust in the cloud has to begin with zero trust outside the cloud. And it's going to be a forever ongoing exercise, which you have to embark on, but it's not solely enough by itself.
Yeah, agreed. I think this is actually something for everyone here. I kind of framed that question the way that I did. This is something that came up as we were bringing this paper together. There's actually a lot of really good evidence behind if we come out of the gate and tell organizations, hey, you need to focus on this one thing, or this is the critical, keystone that you need to be successful. We actually take away from a lot of what security teams actually need because they just get too dedicated down that one particular path. Asset awareness and asset management is one of those things that has surfaced as this, look, it's a great idea, but the dynamic nature of the cloud, the dynamic nature of all these products and services, it's impossible to ever get to 100%. So are we ever fighting kind of a losing battle, or can we establish a best level possible while focusing on some of the other things out there? And I think access rights falls into that as well. Knowing what your accounts have access to, plus knowing what those things are that they have access to is another great start behind this. Now, let's go into another step. We've really got three more questions, but I'm going to combine these two, Gokul. So we have two questions that focus on cloud backups here. The first one is, should we be utilizing cloud backups? Number one. And then number two, there's this other interesting approach, which is, well, on-prem backups themselves are a target, something that attackers go after. Is it the same in the cloud? So is it worth using them? And if we use them, aren't we just creating another thing for attackers to go after?
For sure. I mean, I think there's no question there that backups in the cloud are good, necessary. All persistent data should be backed up. All serverless code, for example, should be backed up. What I would say is one should go one step further, which is create as much distance between your production workloads and your backup as possible, which means go as far as backup off cloud if possible, those kinds of things. And those disaster recovery scenarios should be rehearsed from time to time. Like every once in a while, run an exercise to bring up your production stack from backups wherever they may be housed, and treat security of those backups with as much priority and independently from your primary. Because if an attacker manages to evade countermeasures on the primary, you don't want them to be able to use the same measures to go hit the backups.
Yeah, agreed. I think that's a good approach on it. Oops. All right, and then the last question we've got lined up, Gokul, I think you have some stuff from Vectra teed up for us as well. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Well, we'll keep this one brief then, because I think this might lead into some of the things that you're talking about as well. Not last, but one of the other things that we address in the paper here is talking about an effective cloud detection and response approach. This is really the crux of one of the key differences I wanted to focus on from a cloud perspective, where, again, if I have everything inside of a protected perimeter, minimal ingress egress points, I can wrap certain controls around those that I just cannot deploy against, a cloud infrastructure, if you will. I cannot turn on network monitoring for everything and do it successfully. It's just way too much going on. So in my opinion, an effective detection and response approach is one that focuses really on the login and metadata around your cloud providers. I think that's where you're going to find some of the most consistent success from a security perspective. Now, does that mean I'm not going to turn on, maybe in my virtual machines, deploy some agents that connect back to an EDR tool? Certainly, if that's the approach we've got in place. And if those instances, if those virtual machines are persistent enough that I can actually get value out of that approach. Am I going to turn on network monitoring for maybe some certain assets or get in NetFlow data and things like that? Absolutely. I'm not going to try and NetFlow everything, but I think some of those same approaches can be adopted to the cloud. But we talked about this during our paper setup here. It is just simply not scalable to say, I'm going to network tap the entire infrastructure and hope that we can find some bad inside of this here. Gokul, what are your thoughts on detection and response when it comes to the cloud?
Yeah, I think the key pillars of this, I distill it to 4 or 5 capabilities. The first is the ability to look everywhere without silos, because attackers go from one part to another, starting with identity, like you said, but then they're going to move through the services and regions and accounts. So you've got to be looking everywhere holistically, not at silos. The second is the ability to detect early in the attack progression. Without question, that's your best chance of stopping the attack, because impact in the cloud, especially with how automated it is, will be very widespread and very quick. So you've got to detect it before the attacker gets to that point. You've got to respond efficiently, which means prioritize, investigate, all of that. And once you have, if you've got the right set of capabilities that give you that prioritization and confidence in those alerts, you have to remediate automatically. Because if you've got an attacker ready to encrypt 100 buckets, you're not going to stop them 1 bucket at a time. Mm-hmm. Right? So those are, in my opinion, the key pillars. So you've got to look everywhere, detect early, respond efficiently, and remediate automatically.
Agreed. I like that. I like the inclusion of some of the automation we can throw in there as well, because I really think that's what's needed, especially at the dynamic nature of the cloud perspective. Gokul, we've got about 7 minutes or so left. I wanted to hand it over to you to see what else you've got to share with our attendees today. I know there's a few questions in queue as well, but I want to make sure you've got a chance to walk through some of the stuff you've got here lined up for us. And then if we have any time left, we'll get to the Q&A at the end. If not, folks, those of you that ask questions, we'll get those submitted afterwards, and we'll do our best to get some answers out over to you as well. But Gokul, please, as much as you'd like to share with us, go for it.
Thank you, Matt. So I'll keep this brief and quick. So by way of introductions, Vectra is a leader in the threat detection and response space, and we go across campus, data centers, identity providers, and public clouds. Right? So one of the questions that came up early was, what does a ransomware attack in the cloud look like? So there's just a couple of scenarios here. This one was a real attack on compute services, whereby the attacker essentially was able to leverage stolen EC2 credentials to access the control plane of the cloud, discover what VMs are there, and then essentially find where all of the code that the VMs execute off of is housed, and then essentially ransomed the image and the code. And so, that was a targeted attack on compute services, happened for real. Another scenario was something more targeted at that can be more targeted at storage, and this is where this is essentially ransomware in place, not a byte of data moved out of the cloud, but essentially you've got attackers encrypting, essentially replicating the bucket, changing the key policies on the victims, the original production bucket, and having full control over the encryption on the attacker bucket. Without all of this is just attacker having credentials to come in, nothing moving out of the cloud, right? So these are just two examples of how ransomware attacks in the cloud can play out, targeting different services. So then what options do you have? Like we discussed, you can do a lot of good to have hygiene measures, but none of them is a guarantee to prevent a ransomware attack, right? Especially because attacks may begin outside the cloud, and zero trust is, like we said, ideal but not guaranteed. It's an exercise that will go on for a long time. You cannot recover easily because impact is very quick and broad. And given how the cloud providers have positioned themselves, the reason they have our trust is because they commit that they have no backdoors, easy backdoors into your cloud. So even they cannot help you recover. So then really your only out is to detect. And like we said, detect, look everywhere, detect early, and remediate quickly. So that's exactly what we at Vectra do. We have a solution that goes across identity, public clouds, and campuses, and it's built with the SecOps analyst in mind, right? So we have a portfolio of high fidelity machine learning based detections, which then contribute to a high confidence prioritization. And all these alerts are attributed to offenders, we don't focus on the target. And what that means is where to act, right? It doesn't help you if I give you a list of 100 S3 buckets that are currently the target. You need to know who's after them, which identity got compromised. And that's how we prioritize. And then we've got investigative capabilities that tells you exactly where else the attacker is looking, and then the APIs to programmatically respond. That's basically the core of what Vectra delivers. And this is essentially, for the key is ease of deployment, which comes as part of our SaaS solution. So yeah, there's a lot of data we put out there. There's a free eval. We'd love for you to join in and try. And then, the buying journey should be no different from any other cloud product you buy. So this was basically a quick introduction to Vectra. And that's it for me. Back to you, Matt.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Gokul. Appreciate it. We have time probably to get to one question. First off, someone did make a comment as we were going through our discussion a little bit earlier. The reason for multi-factor or two-factor authentication is that cyber insurance companies are forcing companies to enable it. I'm not sure if that's a negative connotation or not. I'll be honest. I'm glad to see an external force putting pressure on multi-factor authentication. I just hope that it's a good thing and that the organization's seeing it as a benefit and it's not necessarily a disruptor. Full disclosure for everyone, I've worked with some organizations who go really, really hard on timeouts, and feel like you're entering codes or touching that YubiKey multiple times a day. The first couple of days, it gets a little irritating, but then afterwards you realize, what the benefits of what you're doing here. Another question that came in, Gokul, maybe I'll throw this one over to you first if you're able. It says, are you still seeing data encryption in cloud environments, or are attackers mainly exfilling data and using the pay or leak approach, or the extortion, if you will?
Yeah, I mean, it's actually in the cloud, we've seen it turn into a combination of both. Right? The fact that you don't have to, you can do the pay or leak without moving data out of the cloud. Essentially, the attacker is the only one who has access to the replicated bucket, and the owner does not. And so you just, pay up for the keys to access your own data in your own environment. Right? So that's how we are seeing this evolve.
Excellent. All right. And with that, we are right at time. So first off, everyone, thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you so much for those questions, and love the back and forth as well. Gokul, thank you for joining me as well. Had a lot of fun going through and delivering this content. I know we had some interesting times putting this paper together, but I'm glad we were able to kind of focus on that cloud native ransomware, and then also get our attendees to a point where they're starting to think about some of the different approaches and some of the different things that they should be aware of as well. With that said, on behalf of SANS, thank you again, everyone. Carol, I'm going to hand it over to you to take us home today.
All right. Thank you so much, Matt and Gokul, for your great presentation, and to Vectra for sponsoring this webcast, which helps bring this content to the SANS community. To our audience, we greatly appreciate you listening in. For a schedule of all upcoming and archived SANS webcasts, including this one, please visit sans.org/webcasts. Until next time, take care, and we hope to have you back again for the next SANS webcast.